gathering today is part of a series that we have begun, and we're having so much fun with it. This is called Fearless Hearts. We called it Fearless Hearts, Women Leaders in Contemplative Social Action. Kind of a mouthful, but the point of it really is to host prominent women in contemplative practice, but they're also engaged in social action in various ways, and who bring unique perspectives to us. And I guess I could say my subversive goal is to really offer inspiration, encouragement, mentorship, if you will, creativity to younger women and certainly men as well, but younger women who are beginning their path of contemplative social action, as it were. So we've had it's been fun so far, and we've got we have more events scheduled. Take a look at our calendar on the website. One of the blurb writers in Helen's book, Natalie Goldberg, will be a guest a little later in the year. So we're in good company, and we kicked off with Jane Hirschfield. So I think we're having a good time here. So when we first came on, Helen and I were chatting, and she asked me how am I doing, and I said, "Well, I'm beside myself because I've been looking forward to this." And I finished Helen's book, and I'm going to shamelessly plug it at least once, if not more times. Well, let's just get that out of the way right off the bat. Lotus Girl came out just recently, and it is Helen's life memoir, subtitled "My Life at the Crossroads of Buddhism in America," and that subtitle could not be more apt. Helen has been part of the American Buddhist scene for decades. Not the earliest event, of course, but she was the founding editor of Tricycle magazine, and I don't know if this is an admission or something I should be proud of. I've read every single issue since 1991.
Yes.
I used to have them all on my shelf, next to every issue of Ramparts magazine and Coevolution Quarterly. But I finally jettisoned all that because it was so heavy to move around. But I've enjoyed Tricycle magazine since the very beginning. But Helen was involved, much before that, coming out of the 60s. Us counterculture 60s people did not necessarily pioneer Buddhism in America. I think one of our early touch points with Buddhism in America was 1895 or whatever it was, the world. I never remember the exact name, but the world,
Parliament, the World Parliament of Religions.
Yes, in Chicago, I think maybe is where it was, and then of course, through the middle part of the 20th century, and people like Gary Snyder and Robert Aitken and so many others that were there early, most all of whom Helen has met and spent time with and interviewed. It's not part of necessarily what we're talking about today, but and I don't know the date, but it's up there on my shelf. Zen in America. It was just a book that Helen wrote, wonderful profiling of, I believe, 5 American, first generation American Zen teachers. And for anybody that's interested in that topic, it's brilliant. And if I remember right, it came out roughly around the same time as Rick Field's How the Swans Came to the Lake.
It came out several years earlier.
Yeah.
It came out at least 5 years later.
Yeah. I kind of put those together in my mind because they both help paint such a great picture. Um, so welcome, Helen, and thank you so much for being here. And I'll try to keep my enthusiasm in check here. I finished telling.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be with you and to meet you and to be on this podcast with you. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. And we'll, uh, I'll try to get a conversation going here with some questions, but maybe we'll pause every once in a while and see if others have questions as well.
Okay.
And I'm a little bit handicapped because I did just finish your book, so I know the answers to some of these, but not everybody has. So maybe I could start by asking you, and I don't want to answer the question in the question, but it's been a circuitous ride as Buddhism has taken hold. And let's not talk. We won't talk so much about Europe, but it happened in Europe. It's happened in Brazil, elsewhere. But in the United States, it's been a real windy path. And at some point in the book, you really, a number of places, you really describe the various twists and turns and mistakes that we made and kind of arrogances and foolishness and posturing and cultural appropriation. I mean, all of this. Is there anything that you can say for everybody else's benefit here to kind of encapsulate that? From and I realize that's a big question, but I feel like we've settled down. But maybe there's a teacher that we all know that I don't remember who said this, but they said something like it's going to take 7 generations, before this really takes root here. But is there anything you can say about that arc? Read my book, maybe.
Well, I certainly agree with you that we've settled down. I'm not sure, but I'm not sure that we're not going to take another twist and another turn. I think at this moment we've settled down, but I also think that in so many ways, the history of Buddhism, as we've noted in this country, has echoed and reflected the culture at large. And certainly, there's no way to understand what happened in terms of Buddhism in 1960s and 70s without understanding the Vietnam War, psychedelics, and the whole counterculture movement. And so now we're in such a different environment. Compared to those days, we're in a very sort of feels a little bit straight-laced to me. It seems a little, I don't like to use the word conservative because it has so many triggers, but it feels like a much more sober, let's say maybe, time where it's maybe less wild, less, but also maybe less experimental, maybe less curious. I'm not sure. So there is definitely a settling. And I hope that the settling is a reflection of a kind of seriousness and not just a kind of resignation or a plodding along. But actually, I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah.
Some of the participants who I see coming listed as coming from other centers, or somebody just came from retreat, they might have more of a sense of it than I do. I don't really know.
Yeah. I'm curious what you think about this. It does seem like, and my experience is purely within the Zen realm, and even at that, pretty much purely within White Plum. But it does seem like, as we've settled a bit, certain realms of practice have maintained that very Japanese sort of early discipline, look, and flavor. I think Zen Mountain Monastery is probably this way. I would imagine Bruce was just at Daibasat, so I would imagine that they are too. And I think Joan's place in Santa Fe maybe is quite a bit that way. Well, while others have really relaxed so much of that. Norman Fisher's groups are very relaxed in that regard in terms of some of that outer appearance of the practice. Jill Quebec I practiced with years ago, and she had done it even then. She kind of went back and forth, and there were times where she just let everybody know we're not wearing robes anymore. Come in your sweatsuit or whatever. And she had a rock on the altar instead of a Buddha statue, and things like that. Any thoughts about that? About that variety?
Well, I think the variety is wonderful. I'm very much in favor of the diversity and the variety, and I hope that gets continued. What comes to mind is that I haven't been at the editorial desk at Tricycle for many, many years, but I am on the board of directors still. And so every once in a while, we're called on, and it comes up at board discussions, to take a position as, quote, Buddhist, like a Buddhist position. And I'm very happy to say that from my point of view, there isn't one, and I hope it stays that way.
Yeah.
And I think it will stay that way as long as we can honor and accept and allow for the fact that we have many voices, and that we don't need, that from my point of view, we don't need to fall into line around one voice or one view, or this is how the Buddhists think. I hope we don't get there. For years now, I mean, starting 20, 30 years ago, there were suggestions about, having a kind of Buddhist federation, like the Jewish Federation of something or other, or obviously we don't have a papal authority. My own preference would be to see it stay disorganized and diverse, not to have to be in dialogue, to respect each other's views and opinions, both as individuals and as groups. And I think that feels to me like a very healthy alternative to any attempt to mainstream a way of thinking. We see a lot of that in our culture today, not necessarily in Buddhism, but to kind of mainline a particular view. And I prefer the more the disorganized jumble of different voices.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting puzzle to consider, to take a practice that is decidedly and inherently and primarily non-dogmatic, and then try to lay a structure on top of that is so. In Zen Peacemakers, we are called on frequently, not frequently, but from time to time, to sign on to positions and to take a stance against something.
I lost you.
Oops. Chloe, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, now we're back. We're called on to take positions, for and against something that's going on in the world, and that's not our practice. That's not what we do, and it can be troubling to people, I think, sometimes too. And it doesn't mean that we don't care by any means at all. It's quite the opposite. Let me kind of go in a different direction. If you would, maybe share the story of where the name Lotus Girl came from.
Oh, yeah. Let's see if I'm wearing my mala. I was in Nepal. It was in 1965 or 66. I can't remember. It was my first trip to Nepal. And I was about 22 years old, maybe 23. And I was a hippie, and I was wandering around without much intention of any kind. And I got there was a restaurant named the Tibetan Blue, and I used to give English lessons to the owner and his assistant in exchange for free meals. And every day on the way to the restaurant, I passed a Tibetan trader. And part of the story is that he, at least is that my understanding, is that he found out that I was doing volunteer work at a refugee camp west of Pokhara. And I think this factors into the story. So one day he called me over to where he sat with his wares. And he called me over, he said, "Lotus girl." And he put this mala around my neck, which I still have. This mala has broken many times. It's not the same string. String is broken many times. When it's in a public place, I do my best to collect the beads, but I don't usually get all of them. So it has some new beads in it and old beads. And anyway, he put these beads around my neck and he told me to take the Buddha beads to America. And that's what I did. And that's where the name came from.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. It's an interesting coincidence. We're having this conversation in my local Zen center on Monday evening. Several of us practice leaders are going to share our Zen life path with the Sangha and then take questions and so forth. And the point, and I'm not trying to change the subject, but the point of that really is, especially for people who are newer to practice, to get across the idea that there isn't a right way and there isn't necessarily a straight line. And we don't always, and maybe never, know why we're doing this. So kind of with that as a setup, I'll just go ahead and step right into it and say, do you have any idea why you did what you did?
Yeah, I was unhappy. So, I mean, I think that maybe we all share, every single one of us in the whole world might share some varying degrees of dissatisfaction, of dukkha, dissatisfaction. But I think that I knew about mine earlier, perhaps, than other people. Some people have to sort of crash in a big way. Say, actually, maybe this life I'm leading isn't working out too well. But I had a pretty good sense at quite an early age that I was not happy in the life that I was leading. And so there was a lot of inspiration to try to figure out some alternative. And that involved taking drugs, it involved going to Asia, all of those things figured into it. Yeah. And I feel incredibly lucky that in a way I kind of backed into what I backed into, because it's not as if I'm not one of those people who read Siddhartha and, took off for India or Nepal and sat in a Tibetan monastery for 12 years or whatever. That was not my path at all. So I just feel incredibly fortunate that through stumbling and bumbling, and somehow I encountered this extraordinary path.
Your dad gave you gurdjieffs, though, didn't he?
That's true. Yeah.
It's interesting about saying that you were unhappy. I recall one section where I can't remember exactly the context, but a friend of yours had said something like, "You haven't suffered enough." And your reflection was, well, that's, there's some truth to that. I mean, my life's not been perfect, and I've had some sadness and some, perhaps depression and so forth, but it's been generally okay. And but it's out.
Yeah. In that story where she says to me, the story is that she herself, she was quite an advanced student in the Tibetan world. And this was in 1976, and she had already spent several years in Darjeeling studying with Dujin Rinpoche and Khandra Rinpoche. And so she was in New York. And so the story is that she, at one point, we're standing out on the railing of the Tibetan center that we started in 1976, Yeshe Ningpo, and she's kind of pawing the ground like a filly, like the way a young horse can like paw the ground, and saying, "I want to get enlightened." And it was very dramatic, but I felt that there was something very genuine in what she said. And so then a couple of nights later, we were walking down the street together, leaving the center, and I said to her, I don't want to get enlightened, and I'm wondering why that is. And she shot back to me, you don't suffer enough.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And so I was thinking, yeah, this bad thing never happened to me. I was never lived in a war zone. I was never raped. Neither of my parents ever died when I was little. A sibling didn't die. It was like all these different. And then it suddenly I stopped because I thought the Buddha did not describe suffering as a pile up of bad things that happened to you, and that whoever's pile is the highest is whoever suffers the most. That was not his description. But I do go on to say that I think that the First Noble Truth has a lot to do with leaning into your suffering and accepting your suffering, closing the gap between you and the object of suffering. And so my conclusion was that if that's what she had meant, she would have been right. That at that time I had not yet accepted my own suffering, even though I said earlier that I was aware of a certain kind of unhappiness. I was aware of it, but that was a huge gap between being aware of it and accepting it.
The title of this series is Fearless Hearts. Do you feel like you are one?
A fearless heart?
Yeah.
I think we all have such different areas of where we're fearless and where we're not. I went off to Asia when I was 22. A lot of people considered that unbelievably courageous.
Yeah.
But, I had friends living in circumstances that I couldn't tolerate because I was too afraid. I grew up in the city. I couldn't walk into the woods to use an outhouse without fearing that I was going to be attacked by mountain lions and bears or something. So I just think that everybody's got different, capacities. I had some kind of capacity to travel in Asia when I was very young. But there are a lot of things I couldn't do, and there are a lot of things that terrified me that are very comfortable for others. So I don't know.
Yeah. Did you feel, I had a teacher, decades ago tell me, one of the best things you can do to develop courage is to travel by yourself. Did it have that effect on you?
Well, again, I can see the ways in which it took courage and amplified courage.
Yeah, yeah.
But I can also see areas where, it left me as fearful of things as I was before I traveled. So I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I was, reading those, that period in your book where you were traveling so much. I was, I don't want to say impressed. I'm not trying to flatter, but I was impressed because I've traveled a lot in Asia and elsewhere, but more recently, and it's still challenging. And I thought, man, Helen was doing this when, before it was that friendly necessarily to folks from the West. You certainly weren't a pioneer of traveling in Asia, but
Well, I think I'd say that when I first got to India on that same trip, I arrived in Delhi. I was completely freaked out. And I spent 4 days in bed at a YMCA, no, woman's, what do you call it?
YWCA.
Yeah, and it was run by nuns, and I felt very safe in there. But boy, I didn't want to leave my room because the attention that, as a young white woman traveling alone, the attention that I got when I left their premises was terrifying to me. So, I was not courageous in all situations. I went running back in there, and I stayed there and I was ready to go home at that point. But I had a friend in New York who, just before I left, said, if there's one place in all of Asia you have to visit, it's Kathmandu. I had never heard of Kathmandu. I had no idea where it was. I didn't know what
Really?
about it. I didn't know. So I'm lying in this YWCA in in Delhi, trying to figure out how I'm going to get to Kathmandu because I don't want to leave my room. So I finally did. The nuns helped me figure out how I'm going to get to the train station. I'm going to go to Pune. I'm going to fly to Kathmandu. Well, then I got to Kathmandu. I completely fell in love with Kathmandu. And for whatever reason, the fear that I had in Delhi just lifted. And I could go anywhere in Kathmandu and Nepal, and I never had the same. I might have been afraid of like cobras, but I was never afraid of people and of the whole kind of being a young Western woman alone. I never had that. That never returned.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Regarding Kathmandu, and I've never made it there. The closest I got was Bangladesh. But you did a beautiful job of describing that when you were there, it was kind of at the beginning of bohemian incursions into the place, and there were all manner of freaks and weirdos like I was at the time. But then the growth of that exponentially when you went back later. Could you say something about that? Because it sounds like it was just dizzying how much the place had changed.
It's true. But on the other hand, it's now been 40, 50, 60 years, 60 years ago. So, when we read history books, oh, this happened in 1810, and then how we are in 1870, we're not so shocked. But yes, in your own lifetime, it is quite amazing. There's tremendous growth. When I lived in Kathmandu in 1965, I had an apartment that faced an area, for those of you who know Kathmandu, a very well-known temple complex called Swayambhu, which was kind of at the edge of the city. And I had a direct shot. I could see the stupa on that. And now it's just completely built up. It's house to house to house to house. It used to be just mustard fields. And yeah, the pollution is hideous. It's just awful. It's a rare day that you can even see the Himalayan mountains. And in 65, you saw them every day. At the same time, I have to say that there's still something very magical for me about Kathmandu. It still has, I don't know whether it's the history, the karma, whatever you want to call it, but there's still a very magical quality to being there. And I go quite often now, and I still love being there.
Wonderful, wonderful. I was touched by your experiences with, and I don't intend our whole conversation to be about travel, but I'm kind of stuck on that a little bit right now. Your experiences in Vietnam, just kind of the random, I think it was random occurrence of landing at Tan Son Nhut Airport in Ho Chi Minh City, in 1968? No, earlier than that.
This was
65?
Yeah, I think it would have been might have been 65 or 66 in Saigon. Yeah, Ho Chi Minh, Saigon. Yeah.
And then going back later, I was never there in the 60s, but I've been there a half a dozen times 10, 15 years ago, both Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City. And you said something, I'd be interested just to hear you talk about Vietnam. It's a place I love. I love Vietnam. And I really appreciated how you described that, and I don't want to take away your talking points, but for us going there, speak for myself, for me going there, it's all about the war. It's all about 50 years ago. For the Vietnamese people, most of whom are half my age or younger, they don't even, it's not even on their radar. That's all. Maybe talk about Vietnam, Vietnam just generally here, because it figures so much in counterculture and in the politics of the time, and really, the emergence of Buddhism in the United States. It's really a pivotal.
The Lotus Girl starts, it opens up with the image of Thich Quang Duc self-immolating in 1963. So for our generation, no one who's ever seen that photograph, and most of us have seen it, we never forgot the photograph. I also discovered that a lot of Americans who very clearly remember the photograph don't quite remember it quite correctly. He was not protesting the American presence. Thich Nhat Hanh was protesting the crackdown by his own government on Buddhist clergy. Prime Minister Diem was a fundamentalist Catholic. This was a holdover of the French colonial days. About 10% of the country had converted to Catholicism under the French. 90% was Buddhist, but he had this grand idea that he was going to make Vietnam a kind of outpost of the Vatican. And that's what Quan Duc was protesting. And the book opens that way because of its enormous impact on me. For those of you who don't know the photograph, the significance of this incident is not just somebody self-immolating. We now have quite a few examples of somebody self-immolating, including Tibetans protesting the Chinese presence, including sort of a very disturbed human being in front of the Trump trial in New York a month or two ago. So we have lots of images. This one is of somebody sitting in full lotus posture in monk's robes in perfect equanimity. He doesn't flinch. So that's what the photograph for me, what captivated me is how does somebody's body sit in what we project to be nothing but a huge amount of pain, and where's the mind that doesn't flinch? Where's the mind that's not pulling away? And so that's how the book opens, because it was my introduction. It's probably the first time that I ever saw a Buddhist monk. And then I got increasingly involved in the war. I married a draft resistor, moved to Canada at that time. And then when I finally went to Vietnam, it was totally about the war. And I had watched all the old movies and I read some of the old books that I had originally read. And of course, that war was not there. That was all going on in my head. It's like what you said. It just had nothing to do with what was going on the ground. All the young people wanted to talk about what nightclubs they liked to go to, what clubs they were the best for dancing. And the older people, if they wanted to express anything political, they were nervous about the Chinese control of their water systems. But the war, no.
Yeah. I hesitate a little bit to do this, but just so we include everybody, and some people here are younger and maybe have not. I don't mean to be shocking, but so that we know what Helen is talking about. That is
Oh, fantastic. Yeah. Yeah, there he is. Yeah. Yeah.
and
At the time, there were many Buddhist demonstrations going on, and so the press was alerted, but nothing much of consequence happened. So a lot of the press didn't show up. But David Halberstrom was there, and some other very well-known Western journalists, and they certainly described their own visceral horror at watching human flesh turn to ash, but nobody knew what to do with this guy's mind. Nobody knew how to describe this tranquility, this state of composure. So they kind of circumvented that. They talked about politics. They didn't talk about what they were actually seeing.
Yeah. Maybe at this point, I can keep going, but I want to share. We've got a couple dozen of us here today. If anyone has a question for Helen, please let's just take a little bit of time here and take other folks' questions. You can raise your electronic hand. It's down under reactions, and please join in here. There's one. Rayron, thank you so much for rescuing me.
Hi. Well, thank you, Helen. This is wonderful. It's really beautiful. I'm wondering, I'm not even reading the magazines anymore because I find that it's kind of shallow. I'm sorry to say. Um, so how do you see the Buddhist magazines that are on the market now?
Well, I think it depends. I think there are a lot of practitioners who have been practicing for 20, 30, 40 years who have many more things to read that are of much deeper interest to them than a magazine that's sold on a newsstand. I think for what it's doing and for its distribution and its audience, frankly, I think the editor at Tricycle now, James Shaheen, is doing a brilliant job.
Mm-hmm.
But if your focus is practice and you want to keep turning to practice, that's probably not the text that you're going to pick up. So I think that makes a lot of sense to me. I don't know what your practice history is, but I personally always find something to read in Tricycle that, and I'm often, I have to say, quite honestly, I'm quite stunned by how much material is in every issue that I find something of interest. But I certainly understand people who've been practicing for many, many years who tell me they don't want to pick it up anymore. Everybody's got a limited amount of time, and you have to choose what's going to be the most inspiring for you. And if you're in a particular tradition or you're in a particular practice, and that's where you want to go, then that's what you're going to gravitate towards, of course.
Yeah, I was maybe a little bit too harsh. I do actually read some of the articles. I am the resident teacher here at the Milwaukee Zen Center, and my sangha actually read these magazines and they're very happy in reading them. So for myself, I mean, what I read, I basically know, and you're right. I mean, I'm looking for kind of deeper, but also I'm nowadays more interested also in other voices. So I'm, doing a workshop with a process philosopher and, just trying to open up because I think Buddhism can be a little bit insular. So, but thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for your question, Reverend. And just on the topic of the magazine, anymore these days, it seems like it would be an ongoing challenge to put out a publication that appeals to people who are just beginning their practice and are trying to explore, and people who have been doing this since the 1960s. That's quite a lift, I think. Maybe Helen, you could say a little bit more about the beginning days of the magazine. It sounded very hand to mouth and very tenuous, but the biggest thing that you did, and maybe you could talk about this a little bit, was to offer something that was not from one lineage or tradition or another, but that appealed to all of them, that was not sanctioned or rubber stamped by roshis or lamas or acharyas or whoever else it might be. It was independent of that. And it seems to me you took heat from 360 degrees. you took it from everybody. maybe talk a little bit about, and it was such a pioneering thing at the time. I mean, I loved it because it was just fresh, and it wasn't, it wasn't Windbell from San Francisco Zen Center, which is a great publication, but it was broad. It was broad and really appealed.
When we started Rick Fields and I started talking about this in about 88, 89. The first issue came out in 91. And there was a backstory to what we were doing, because initially there were conversations about this in the early 80s about putting together a non-sectarian magazine, and Rick and I were talking about it with some friends at CCLA, and I think this is in the 80s. You were around at that time, and maybe some people up in San Francisco. But it sounded like a kind of wonderful idea. We were going to have so much fun. We were going to get together and do this pan-Buddhist magazine and non-sectarian, and then before we ever had a chance to really think about it seriously, we had all these scandals hit the Buddhist communities and the Zen community, the Tibetan community, and in the Theravada Vipassana community. So then the possibility of doing something, creating a platform where we could communicate some of these issues became a little bit more pressing and a little bit more serious. It wasn't just, oh, we're going to get together, we're going to have such a great time, it's going to be so much fun. It wasn't fun there for a while. I mean, not in terms of the magazine, but in terms of our lives as Buddhists in America, there were a lot of things going on that were not fun. They were disturbing, they were upsetting, they were dislocating, they were very confusing about behavior, about the teachers' behavior. And but the underlying themes of the magazine and what we were going to try to do, the idea wasn't, well, let's just expose all these scandals. It was like, okay, well, there was a need for a Buddhist magazine, but the basic Buddhist views that we were presenting was Buddhism 101. It could not have been simpler. Life is impermanent, everything is impermanent, everything is going to come to an end. Who we think we are, who the self is, may not be exactly how you understand it. These are, the basic building blocks. And I think people these days can tend maybe to forget that at any time in our history, whether it was 1991 or now, to suggest in a public forum, in a public magazine that's on sale at the newsstand, that material goods are not going to create happiness is actually a totally radical thing to do. It still is.
Yeah.
It still is. I mean, we say it and nobody quite believes it because we keep indulging in buying the same bullshit, whatever we're doing.
Yeah.
But actually we can forget how radical that is. That is, if you take that to heart and you orient your life around that, it's a very radical thing to do. And So in the beginning, we had we had this big job of kind of trying to present Buddhism in a very reasonable way that did not kind of succumb to all the criticisms that we were getting in terms of the scandals. But the basic teachings and the basic impulse for what we wanted to do was so simple. I think James Sheen at the magazine today has a much harder job, much harder.
And because why, Helen?
Because even though we had different lineages and different schools of thought, there was a lot of agreement about what Buddhism is, what practice was, what our roles were as practitioners, and the relationship of Dharma to the society at large. I think these days, the younger generation is questioning everything, as our generation did also. But so there's a lot of questioning of some of the things that we took for granted. There's a questioning of, well, what is enlightenment? Is enlightenment worth it? What are we even doing? Who cares? There's a lot of questioning and even dismissal of things that were very dear to an older generation. So all of that has to be reconfigured and is being reconfigured. But it doesn't have the same, we don't have the same guideposts are not there that once existed. So I think in those ways, I think James's job is harder.
Thank you, Jacqueline. I see your hand. Thank you so much, Jacqueline. And anyone else, feel free to put your hand up, and we'll just weave everybody in today.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Quite well.
Okay. With so many different factions of Buddhism and so many different viewpoints of what Buddhism is, and with so many levels of understanding and like from starting out to deep in, how do you possibly put together an issue? How do you choose which subjects to include?
Well, honestly, really, you should ask James Shaheen onto your show if this is what people are interested in, because this is what he has to deal with. I had to deal with it 25 years ago, but not to the extent that he does. The kinds of things that you just mentioned, 25 years ago, every one of those distinctions were closer together. And now every one of the things you mentioned are very, very, very far apart. I know that one of the things that I like about reading Tricycle is I read things, let's say there was an article that I read, I think it might have been maybe either in this issue or the previous one, with a Pure Land priest. And I found it fascinating. I found it totally interesting, things that I didn't know, because that's not a lineage that I've studied very much about. So I like learning those things about lineages that I'm quite outside of, or an article about deity practice, which even though I'm in the Vajrayana tradition, I do not practice deity practice. So there's a lot, I find it very rich in those ways, but how you make those decisions, I don't know. Fortunately, I'm very glad that I'm not making them anymore. So I'm not the right person to answer you, but thank you for the question anyway.
Thanks, Jacqueline. Good to see you. Anybody else have something? We're all friends here. Feel free. Join the conversation. I want to ask about, and again, I think some folks here are young enough that they may not have been so aware of the scandals of the time that you referred to. And you're right, they really did rock a lot of people. I speak for myself, to be sure, just our faith in things that we had assumed, perhaps wrongly as well. Buddhist teachers are not perfect. They are still people and they make mistakes. But is there anything that you think came from those occurrences, that was good for us, that was beneficial?
Oh, yes. Yeah. I think the most beneficial thing that happened at that time, and I think I say this in the book, but maybe I didn't elaborate as much as I could have. I think that the shock to our idealism was the best thing that ever happened to us. It was great. Now, of course, did I feel that way at the time? No. No, not at all. But in retrospect, I think it was a wonderful thing for the convert community to have our ideal so totally trashed. And that's pretty well what happened. And that was a good thing, because it forced us to really figure out, well, what are we doing? What are we doing? If this is all dependent on teachers outside of ourselves, on their behavior, not our behavior, what are we doing with our lives?
Yeah.
If this is all dependent on their enlightenment and not our enlightenment, what are we doing? How do we go forth? How do we pick ourselves up? Why do we pick ourselves up? So it forced a kind of questioning that was painful and wonderful. That's my answer.
I love that. I love that answer. There's an expression, I don't know where I got it, but it's certainly not mine, but I repeat it. But the notion of giving away our eyes, giving our eyes to someone else. And that's one of the things I felt like I learned was, and it's just like, and you just described it, is not looking back at myself through the eyes of one of these teachers who just made this horrible mistake and ruined a community. Keep my eyes. Since we are here as Zen peacemakers, and it's part of our history, and you were so intimately involved in Riverdale and in Yonkers and so forth for a while there. At one point, you talk about where Bernie decided to open a business, and I know how I was in those days, in terms of my attitudes about capitalism and this, that, and the other thing. And I think what you described was there was a bit of backlash there, and but Bernie pushed through, of course, and started a business, and it's legendary from then on. But maybe say a little bit about that, about uh, him doing that, the circumstances, and the reaction among the community.
Well, my memory is, and my sense of the history of Buddhism, again, among the convert community, is that there are always these moments where a group of people, or maybe one person, I don't know, has this idea about what is the best conduit for Buddhism in the West. What is going to be the best pathway that is going to be the most beneficial for the most number of people? So in the 1950s, there was a lot of emphasis on Buddhism and psychoanalysis, psychotherapy. It's when D.T. Suzuki was teaching at Columbia in 1950. It drew a lot of very well-known psychotherapists. There was a conference in Hawaii, and a book came out of it that was very widely read. Can't remember the name of it now, but something like Zen and Psychotherapy. And so this had a very big stamp on, and Buddhism drew a lot of therapists for very obvious reasons. And then it went through a little period where actually maybe psychotherapy isn't the very best conduit. Maybe business is the best conduit. And so enter Richard Baker at Zen Center in Francisco, with Greens and with very many other different enterprises there, and then Bernie. And I don't remember who else. And then I think even the Zen monastery had a delicatessen that they opened for a while. They were trying. So there was all these different business models. And the pushback around Bernie doing the business wasn't so much that he wanted to do a business. It was that he disappeared from the Zendo. And he disappeared from all the and this was very early on. This was like a year into the kind of startup of the Zen community of New York. And the idea was, if you wanted to study Zen, you could go to the bakery and you could volunteer. And that would be your Zen practice. And that was the part that was really hard to buy into. And I think maybe in Zen Center San Francisco or some of the other places, more of the tradition was maintained simultaneously. I think after I left, I moved from Riverdale back to Manhattan in about 1990. I think after that, there might have been more, I'm not sure. I think there might have been a redress in the balance of what was going on. But there was a period when all of the formal dynamics of Zen were sort of evaporated from the community. They all got moved up to the bakery, not in a informal way. So there was a lot of pushback about that. Bernie wasn't not in the Zendo. There was no Daisan, no Doksan, no Dharma talks. There was a whole a period of that, and that was difficult. Yeah.
Whereas prior to that, it sounds like very, very rigorous practice in Riverdale.
You mean before the bakery or with the bakery?
Oh, before the bakery. I think I recall you describing, long days of sitting.
Well, it was traditional. It was a traditional, follow the tradition. The ballast at the center at that time, even when Bernie was around, that because of the scandals around Edo Roshi at Daibusatsu, we had about 6 monks living at the house that had left Daibusatsu under those scandals, and they were kind of a very kind of strong anchor for the tradition, for monasticism, for the rules, the regulations, and they created a very strong traditional, more or less, given that we're in America and we're American, doing all kinds of American things. But within that context, they provided a very strong ballast for the tradition. Yeah.
Yeah. And it sounds like that change was kind of binary or zero sum or something. It was abrupt and kind of stark. you described San Francisco, and I always got the feeling that people working at Greens or working at the bakery or wherever else it might have been was really blended in with their meditation practice and services and things like that. It was not so binary.
Well, I also, there were circumstances so that, we were always in a financial crisis for years. Before the bakery, during the bakery, after, there was always, and you probably realize this, always financial crises around Bernie, always. They never, as far as I know, they never stopped. So there was always, too few people to do too much work. And so he brought in, pulled in whoever he could. If there was monastics there who were basically vowed to be his students and do what he asked of them, then they were baking bread or driving delivery trucks or whatever.
Yeah. Yep. Let me take a pause here and see if there's anyone who's joined who's got a comment or a question. Such a rich opportunity to touch on this history. I'll keep going then if I don't see anybody's hand. This is called Fearless Hearts, Women Leaders in Contemplative Social Action. I'm curious about your experience of doing the work that you've done for so long, and perhaps it's the magazine or perhaps other things. In your writing, I didn't pick up, and this is just occurring to me now, I don't think I picked up anywhere any reference to gender issues in terms of power dynamics or being stymied by the patriarchy or having to, I mean, even with starting the magazine, that doesn't seem to have ever come up.
Did. You missed a section.
I probably did.
Yeah, it did come up. I did bring it up in the book. I did not, however, bring it up as much as I might have. I do bring it up. I sort of, I tried, not always successfully, but I tried to stick with the view that I had at the time that I had it, rather than jump to, a present view looking back. For example, the YouTube movement definitely refocused my own lens as to how I saw certain things. And I do write about how difficult it was for the men around me to accept that this first Buddhist magazine, first newsstand Buddhist magazine, was actually going to be edited by a woman. That was really hard for some people.
Uh-huh.
But I don't think I actually got the full spectrum of how difficult it was until I looked back. At the time, I don't think I quite got it. And when I look back through that lens, there were a lot of really difficult situations, some of which I do talk about, but I didn't want to place the emphasis where I didn't feel it at the time so much. But there was a lot of misogyny, and there was a lot of, there were a lot of gender issues, and maybe I think I underplayed it because it's not where I wanted to go with the book, and because all of these topics have become so fraught right now, and I'm aged out of a lot of the tension, real intensity around many of them. So I didn't want to pretend, I'm this young person dealing with issues that I'm not really dealing with anymore.
Yeah. It was one of the contradictions of the times that you could go to an anti-war meeting or an SDS meeting or something, and everybody's talking, but all the men expect the women to go get the food and the beer.
Well, it was the exact same way in the Zen centers.
Yeah.
It was the Zen centers, the Tibetan centers, it was exactly the same.
Yeah.
I spent a lot of time around some of the greatest Zen Tibetan masters of the 20th century. Why? I was the cook. The guys weren't going to be in the kitchen. I got to cook. I got to cook for the Karmapa. I got to cook for His Holiness Dudra Rinpoche, for Kenji Rinpoche. It was great. But not the whole story either.
That's one way. That's one way in, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah. Jacqueline, I see your hand again. Hi.
Hi. Following from that issue, I don't know whether or not you were personally involved in it, but I'd be interested in your perception of when people became not just solo people, but families in the movement, early on in the movement, how what your perception of women becoming mothers, how that affected their practice and their orientation to Buddhism.
I can't answer that from any personal experience because I didn't have children and I wasn't involved in that directly. I think that from my memory is that there was a lot of pushback in many areas, in many cases. But at the same time, we were very involved in opening up Buddhism to a secular world and living secular lives. I think we learned very early on that monasticism was not going to be the convert path. It still has a very, very small, monasticism in America is in the Buddhist world is very, very small. And the so-called, when I mean monasticism, I mean some kind of fairly old school version of that. I'm not talking about married priests. I'm talking about old school monasticism, which was not going to be our path. So in order to open it up, we had to become much more generous in our outlook of what was acceptable and what was, and I think there certainly were a number of women who well, some of them, I think, got caught in ideas about what true practice meant in ways that their families did suffer. And others, I think, came along a little later and were able to integrate it a little better with the help of the larger community. So I don't know, that's not a very conclusive or very full answer, but it's the best I can do. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's interesting to think about. Thank you.
There's a question in the chat from Kathy, and Kathy asks, Helen, would you say more about cultural appropriation and how it informs your decisions as a publisher or practitioner?
This is going to be a very annoying answer to a lot of people, but honestly, I've never understood cultural appropriation. I just don't get it. I mean, the history of the world as I understand it is the history of cultural appropriation. I don't know how to think about it. I mean, I read some of these very big books like Yuval Harari's, Homo Sapiens, or David Gerber's The Dawn of Everything. And it just feels like we go from the cultural appropriation these days has a kind of negative association to it. It has a kind of negative bias. But I never hear that it's anything other than change in the world for the last 10,000 years.
Mm-hmm.
So I would like to ask if the person who asked the question could drill down a little bit on what you mean and see if I can respond in a more specific way, because that is truly how I get it. I've been told by friends that their children criticize them for burning incense because it's cultural appropriation. I don't know if that's the kind of thing you're talking about. I don't know. I mean, we drink coffee because it doesn't come from nothing comes from our own culture. We speak a language that didn't come from this culture. We eat foods that don't come from this culture. Nothing. I don't know what native anything means.
That's good. Kathy, if you're interested and you want to raise your hand and clarify your question, that might help. Yeah,
Yeah,
Helen,
really, I asked you to. I would like you to.
okay. I don't see Kathy yet, so
She wrote
oh,
something.
I can't turn. Oh, I see. She's in the chat. Hold on. Let me see what she said here. I can't turn on my mic or camera now, sorry, but I hear you, and I agree with you as a 70-year-old. I think the concept is more about exploitation or profiting
Exploitation or what?
or profiting.
Property, exploitation or property.
Yeah,
I don't know.
yeah, I'm not sure about that either. Yeah, just to punctuate what you said, Helen, I was raised Roman Catholic, and somebody asked me about, well, how did you get into this into Zen practice? I said, well, what 1959 as a kid, where I went to church 6 days a week, and there was a guy in colorful silk robes chanting in a different language and burning frankincense and myrrh, and the pew was hard and my butt hurt and it was cold. So I don't know. You figure you figure it out. Ririn, I see you have your hand again. Thank you for asking.
Okay, I would like actually to respond to Jacqueline's question about women being mothers. I myself am a mother, and I had my children when I was just divorced. And I mean, I started Zen practice when I was just divorced because of the pain. It's really, the suffering brought me to Zen. And I had young children. I was not able to, I mean, I actually thought of leaving them, and I almost did. And then I talked to them and I couldn't do it. And so then I was very angry. I went to my teacher at the San Francisco Zen Center and said, how can I possibly practice? I'm single. I have a full-time job. I have 2 little kids. And she said, don't you know this is your practice? So anyway, but Suzuki Roshi was the one who allowed women in the monastery, the first monastery that he built at Tassajara, the Zen monastery in America, where he was supposed to just have male monks. But then the women said, wait a minute, we are your students too, right? We want to be there. And he said, okay, I guess you're Americans. And he allowed that. And then, of course, there were babies. You can't avoid it, right? And then they did daycare and all this. And then Green Gulch was, started out as a family practice place. And I'm very glad I went to Green Gulch because I had wonderful teachers who were all parents. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for your answer. Thank you.
Thanks for sharing that, Ririn. I want to ask a different kind of question here. I think there are people in life, I don't know, Thelonious Monk, Georgia O'Keeffe, people who very early on just have a clarity about what it is that they want to do. Now, I didn't know either of them. I presume Bob Dylan was this way as well. Just, crystal clear, this is what I want to do. And they just steadily did that their whole life. Did you have kind of an aha moment where you thought, this is how I want to be, Helen Tworkov, and these are the kind of things I want to do? Or
I had many aha moments of saying, I have no idea who I am or what I want to be, and what do I want to be when I grow up? And I asked that question for years. That was not my path at all. It was exactly the opposite.
yeah,
Confusion about where to go, what to do, who I was, who I wanted to be, did I want to be anybody? All of those questions.
wandering around dark hallways. Over the years, who were your allies?
My allies?
Yeah, allies. Yeah.
Allies. Well, I think that the thing that helped steady me at all was that even though I sort of, I could identify the pitfalls of samsara without having enough discipline we talked about courage earlier, to give them up. So I could identify them and then circle back to them and go fall down that rabbit hole again, 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 again. But I think that for all of my confusion, I never stopped identifying something in Dharma that was true, that I felt was true. So I could always the most true. So I always would come back to that, circle back to that. So as far away as I could go in terms of total mental chaos and seduction of this and that, samsaric, glitter. I could see myself going towards that, but I never thought it was because this other thing wasn't good enough. I just saw it as my own limitations or weaknesses. I didn't think it was a problem of the Dharma. I always maintained a sense of something in the Dharma being the most true thing in the whole world. And I had to go back, keep going back to it.
Wonderful, wonderful. As I said when we began, one of my hopes for this series is offering inspiration to younger people starting out, because I think, I confess to having had these attitudes when I was younger, to look at people who were successful and to think that it was a straight line, or that it was easy, or that, boy, I could never do that, because look, that's Helen Tworkov. I could never. Are there examples of times where you completely lost faith? Not so
No.
much.
I had plenty of times where I lost faith in myself, my self-confidence, my self-esteem. All of those were issues for me, but I never thought that reflected something that wasn't true about the Dharma.
Uh-huh.
So in that sense, I never lost faith in the Dharma. But of course, it took a long time for faith in the Dharma and faith in myself to become one and the same. I didn't quite get that.
Yeah.
It was for a long time, the Dharma was something outside of me. The Buddha was something over there.
Yeah. Yeah.
It took a long time to integrate that. So, but I think that I never really lost faith in the Dharma. No.
This is, I don't know how I would answer this question, because I'm not really in the habit of looking back at where I came from and ranking things or judging things. I probably used to do that, but I've let that go completely anymore. So I realized the feet of clay that this question has. But as you look back, what do you feel what's your biggest success is what I want to ask, or what are you most proud of? And I can hear some of the answers, like, well, I don't really indulge in being proud of my, that kind of thing. But of all the things that you've done, which has been extraordinary.
I don't know if I'd use the word success. I don't know exactly what that looks like. And I say that because we have so many associations to that word in our culture. And I'm not sure that whatever I feel matches up with any of them. But I feel really good about my work with Tricycle. I feel really good about that.
Yeah.
I still get amazing letters, or James at the office, James Shaheen will pass on letters to me about what the magazine did for people in their lives, how it connected them to Dharma. And they're still, to this day, immensely moving to me. So I feel really, really good about that. I helped start a couple of Buddhist centers. I wouldn't say that they or the centers were the finest moments. I've co-written 2 books with my Buddhist teacher, my Tibetan teacher, Mingyur Rinpoche. I wouldn't define that as a moment of success, but they certainly were deeply, deeply, deeply rewarding for me, very meaningful for me. Yeah.
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful. I've got a final question, but I want to open it up here before before I do that. Anyone have anything? This is your chance. I'll wait just a second as we're thinking about this. Karen, Ninrin, yeah, hi. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you so much. This has been an absolutely wonderful conversation. I'm really grateful for it. Helen, I did not know anything about your work with Tricycle, though I've read Tricycle for, a while. I first noticed you in your work with translating and working with Mingyur Rinpoche, and I thought there is some remarkable sensibility here, because I think I have a pretty fine-tuned sense of Mingyur Rinpoche's facility with the English language. And clearly here was someone who was a deep, profound practitioner who was partnering with Mingyur Rinpoche's way of wanting to express himself in these incredibly deep experiences of Dharma practice. And I just so I noticed that about you without having had any idea of who you were. And I would just love to hear you reflect on that process of collaborating with your teacher.
It was definitely the greatest privilege of my life, and very unexpected, because at the time that I started to work with him, I had basically, quote, retired from Tricycle. I had stopped working at Tricycle. I didn't know whether I'd ever work again. And then he asked me to work on what was supposed to be a chapbook, like a 35-page book on the foundational practices of Tibetan Buddhism, and that turned into this 350-page book that Shambhala published called Turning Confusion into Clarity. And then the second book was In Love with the World. But I had, when he first asked me, I thought the Tricycle would probably be the most extraordinary, wonderful work that I could ever do. It never occurred to me that I could do anything that would be even more rewarding or a greater gift in my life. And and it's also it came to me. I can't remember exactly how old I was. I was like 65, or maybe almost 70. I don't remember. So it completely reconfigured any ideas I had about going into my old age. Like suddenly, these old age years became honestly the best years of my life. And I know from my own friends who are my age that that's a somewhat rare gift. So I don't know what else to say about it. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Thanks, Karen. Marcia, I see you have your hand on unmute. We have a couple more minutes left here. Upstairs.
Hi.
There you
Yeah, I'm kind of curious. I was in a Zen practice for many years, and I'm now studying Tibetan Buddhism, and I'm finding it in many ways very different than a Zen practice. Some of it is resonating. I went into it with beginner's mind, so to speak. I did not want to make too many comparisons, but just see how it resonated with me. Some of it is resonating, some of it is not. I'm just curious because you're talking about, being with Glassman, which was a Zen practice. What was it about the Tibetan lineage that appeals to you?
I started off in Tibetan Buddhism. I started off, my first experiences with Tibetan Buddhism were with Dudjom Rinpoche. in the mid-70s, and Timmy Norval Rinpoche and the lamas that were around Yeshe Ningpo at that time. And then that Sangha fell apart, as many Nyingma Sanghas seem to. And I didn't really know where to turn. And then a friend of mine introduced me to Glassman. And so the possibility of studying with somebody who spoke English, there were no language barriers, and it was very appealing to me. And that Sangha began to fall apart practically before it started. The community was falling apart as it was coming into being from the beginning. And during my time at the Zen community of New York, I really began to study more and more with Maizumi Roshi. And when he died, which I think was about 1997, there were several years where I was without a teacher and very lost. And that, at a certain point, I had to stop and say, this is not working out for me to not have a teacher. And I began to kind of look around the way I had 30 years earlier or whatever it was. This little retreat, that retreat, checking out this person, that was all kind of didn't feel very good to me. But anyway, I don't want to go over the story again, but at some point I met Mingyur Rinpoche. This is about 2005, something like that. And at that time, I don't know whether he would say the same thing today. I really don't know. But at that time, he had a very clear idea for going forward with his community that was just growing at that time. You could do a sadhana practice, which is a lot of ritual, a lot of deity practice, formal stages of the path for Tibetan Buddhists, or you could do, quote, a meditation practice. And the meditation practice didn't necessarily involve all the bells and whistles of deity practice. Well, coming out of the Zen tradition, I thought this was fantastic. So I don't know whether every community would provide that alternative, but Mingyur Rinpoche did, and I took it. And I've done a little bit of the traditional Tibetan practices, but most of my practice now is without some of the more classic bells and whistles around Vajrayana. I don't know if that answers your question, but I do a practice which is very much in alignment with Zen. Mm-hmm. But I have the inspiration of a teacher that I have tremendous respect for, and who I venerate enormously. So it has that as well.
Thank you.
Thanks for asking, Marcia. Very nice, very nice. We're getting close to the end of our time here. Because of my intention with this, I do need to ask, and this is the kind of a question that can elicit a kind of an aphorism sort of answer, or a meme or a bumper sticker. So I want to try to avoid that. But what advice would you give to people younger in their practice? And the intention here is women, so women, of course, but anyone really. If you feel like giving advice.
I'm pretty good at it. Let's see.
I usually never do what I suggest to myself to do.
Well, there is something I'd like to say, because I think it's a little bit misunderstood by the younger generation, especially those coming into Buddhism now. I would say that if you're involved in any kind of social action work, climate justice work, prison work, soup kitchen work, whatever you're just doing, please, please, please keep doing it. I would also like to say to please consider that meditation practice is also social action. That's how I understand it. That sitting down on your cushion, taking that time away from your conventional version of activity, of what's important, of what's significant, to take time out of that and sit down quietly, that is social action. And how that reverberates from you to the others, to people around you, to your dog, to your housemate, whatever, that is social action. So don't belittle that. Don't belittle it. And that, I think I say this, I tell a story about this in, I think in Lotus Girl, I tell a story about a Tibetan teacher telling a young man at a Q&A, you are the world. You're not separate from this world. So don't you think, oh, I have to go do climate activism over there. I've got to help the climate over there. This is it right here, right now. What you do here does make a difference. And you are the world, to quote this Tibetan teacher, you are the world. So don't, I don't want in any way to discourage you from doing social action. And we should all be doing this whatever we can to help out. But the form that takes has tremendous variation in it. And it can take the form of a very unnoticeable activity, very, very quiet, very solo, whatever it is. And it can make a world of difference. It can really make a world. So don't be dismissive of that because your friends are telling you you have to go on this march and this demonstration, you have to protest this and that. Don't take other people's ideas for what is going to make a difference. Think about it in terms of changing your own mind and your own perception, your own perspective, and consider the enormous vibration out into the world that can have.
Thank you so much. That is the gemstone of this interview right there, just what you concluded with. So and it's so appropriate for Zen peacemakers because this is what we do. So I thank you sincerely for that. And before we close, I also want to thank you for the way you ended the book. And you just referred to this a little bit ago, but talking about getting older and how that is your life, and this is what's going on for all of us, and it just makes me much more comfortable.
Good.
because you mentioned that, and I thought, oh, well, I must be okay. So thank you for that validation. And I want to thank everybody for sticking with us here for an hour and a half and for your attention. This was really rich. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Helen, I hope you did as well.
I did very much. Thank you. Thank you.
And we are recording. The recording usually takes a few days to get cooked and edit a little bit and put up, but it'll be up on the website for everybody to look at here, probably by Monday or something like that. So
thank you.
Thank you so much, Helen.